Podcast that lives, breathes and dies both classic movies and the movies that you're still having therapy for. In today's episode, we take a look at some great movie recastings. So join us as we swap our Asda's Air de Toilette for something more sophisticated, our oversized loafers for some air-cushioned high tops, and an armchair psychiatrist for a Seattle-based radio host. It's time to bury our bones with cinema.
Good evening and welcome to Inside the Actor's Mind, the show that delves deep into the psyche to find out what makes a great character, a great performance, and what makes a great actor. I am Julius Oxbridge Teeth III. Join me as we go deep into the actor's mind. I'm Julius Oxbridge Teeth III. Won't you join me next week as we go deep into the actor's mind?
Welcome to another episode of Bury Our Bones with Cinema. As mentioned, we are going to be looking at some great movie recastings. Now, it's always difficult to recast because unfortunately we're always going to go up against what we know from that character with the original actor. In some cases that can be a good thing, in some cases that can be a bad thing. It could be something that detracts. In today's episode we're going to look at some good ones, try and keep things positive. So, starting off with some honourable mentions. First one I'm going to say is Pierce Brosnan as James Bond. I think Pierce Brosnan for me is joint top James Bond for me, along with Sean Connery. Obviously, Sean Connery is the James Bond. It's the one that everybody kind of goes to. I think in that time between Sean Connery and Pierce Brosnan, we had Timothy Dalton, we had George Lazenby, we had Roger Moore. For me, Roger Moore was very much a little bit too swami, a little bit too, arrogant there. George Lazenby was a little bit forgettable. Obviously, he only had the one film, but not really something where I'm looking at it and going, yeah, there's a lot to work with there. Timothy Dalton, I think, was a little bit ahead of his time. I think he came into the role too soon. I think if it had been after Pierce Brosnan, obviously not in terms of his age, but in terms of the chronology of the series, Daniel Craig came in and made that character a lot more gritty, a lot more modern. I think Timothy Dalton was along that same kind of mindset when he took up his performances as James Bond, but I don't think audiences were quite ready for it. I think he was 20 years too early in that respect. But Pierce Brosnan blended that real kind of spy element of the character, the suave, sophisticated side of James Bond, without going too arrogant. It was definitely a step back to what we liked about Sean Connery, just, removing the vast majority of the questionable antics of James Bond. Obviously, still quite questionable in the 90s and early noughties, but certainly a step in the right direction. Another honourable mention, probably the only reason why I haven't chosen to speak about this one in depth is because it's a little bit too new, but Colin Farrell was the Penguin, Oswald Cobblepot in The Batman. If you listen back to our Untouchables episode, Jim makes good comparisons between Colin Farrell's Penguin and Robert De Niro's Al Capone. Go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already. It's a great ep. But yeah, there's some real correlations between their approaches. Colin Farrell brings a real kind of seedy, disgusting element to Oswald Cobblepot, not in a well, he does do it in a physical way, but less so than Danny DeVito's iteration, but more in a character-based trait rather than it being a physical trait. Whilst DeVito's performance is memorable, it certainly fits within Burton's Gotham. That character and that iteration would not fit within in the Batman in that universe, and I think he takes a grotesque realism with Farrell's performance to the character. And the only criticism is that we didn't really see enough of him in the Batman. Obviously, there's a TV show coming. Check out the trailer for that because it does look great. But I think, unfortunately, we are in the age of where there are going to be lots of spin-offs from things. I think if we didn't get that TV show, we didn't have that further iteration of him playing that, we certainly would be going, we didn't see enough. We did not see enough of Colin Farrell playing Oswald Cobblepot, the Penguin. But the first example of a piece of good movie recasting that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more depth is Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise in It. Obviously recast from the early 90s TV movie played by the legendary Tim Curry. I think Bill Skarsgård brings a very good modern iteration of Pennywise to the forefront that steps a little bit more into horror than it does into comedy. And so the scary moments of Pennywise in the newest iterations of it are more horror-based, rather than being scary because they're so comical and they're, so over the top, like we saw with Tim Curry's. I think both iterations stand and, have merit in their own right. I think, but I do think that Bill Skarsgård is a fantastic recasting. Not to say that he's better, not to say that he does more than what. Obviously, we've seen more of him in those roles. Or in that role, but we don't necessarily need to compare the two. We don't necessarily need Bill Skarsgård to be better or worse than Pennywise. They can stand on their own individual merit. And I'm going to go into a little bit why I think Bill Skarsgård is great in that role, but let's go through those budget and box office figures. So, kicking off with the budget for the first film, I don't think I really focus on the first film in this instance, because that's the first time we really saw Bill Skarsgård in that role. So, it was released in September of 2017 in the United States with a budget of $35 million, which is quite a big budget for a horror film. And it made $123 million back in its opening weekend, which is a fantastic return immediately for not just for a horror film, but for any film in that regard. It's made more than its budget back in its opening weekend, which is fantastic going. I think there's an element of that, which is it's been long enough since the last iteration that audiences were kind of looking for a new version, looking for something, a new retelling of that story. Obviously, it's better for it to be, in the instance of it being actually a proper in the cinema released film as opposed to a TV movie. And obviously, it's kind of done that because now we're much more used to seeing part ones and part twos for popular movies. So 123 million in its opening weekend. It made 328.8 million domestically in its gross, and worldwide it made 704 million in its gross. So again, very, very, very good telling there. Very good numbers when it comes to release. And if we look at the IMDb rating and the audience scores, it tells a very, very similar story. So 7.3 out of 10 for IMDb, 84% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. So very well received. And I think a large proportion of that, with any kind of horror film, is how scary and how fun to watch that central villain is. I think every horror movie that's been successful and has kind of had a franchise has had a central villain that has been scary, that has been iconic, that has been something that we want to return to kind of time and time again. If we look at the film and who made the film, so it was directed by Andy Muschietti, using a script that was written by Chase Palmer, Kari Joji Fukunaga, Gary Duberman, and Stephen King, which obviously was based on the novel of the same name. The producers were Seth Grahame-Smith, David Katzenberg, Roy Lee, Dan Lin, and Barbara Muschietti. The music was composed by Benjamin Wolofish, cinematographer was Chung Hyun Young, and the editor was Jason Ballantyne, cast director was Rich Delia, and production designer was Claude Pierre. So, again, some relatively new names to the horror genre there at the time, and they all worked on this film and created something that really does, as I said previously, stand on its own merit. It works with, again, it's not a sequel, it's a reboot. So reboots are often hit and miss. Then, there's very rarely a reboot where you go, that stands just as much next to the original as anything could. Often reboots, all I can think of is a Total Recall reboot, which, to be fair, I still haven't seen, but there's a reason I haven't seen it. I've seen the trailer. I don't need to go and see a reboot of Total Recall. So it stands on its own 2 feet here. And if we look at the cast, I think one of the things that's really important with this kind of story, and with a lot of Stephen King stories, is its central characters, particularly the young iterations of the characters, need to be cast well. And I think on the whole they are cast well, top to bottom, not just Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise. So if you go through the cast, we've got Jaden Martell playing Bill Denborough. We have Jeremy Ray Taylor playing Ben Hanscom, Sophia Lillis playing Beverly Marsh, Finn Wolfhard playing Richie Tizia, Chosen Jacobs playing Mike Hanlon, Jack Dylan Grazer as Eddie Krasbach, and Wyatt Olef as Stanley Uris, and obviously Bill Skarsgård playing Pennywise. Now, obviously, there are some recognisable names there. Finn Wolfhard, who plays one of the central characters in Stranger Things, that obviously being a very, very popular TV show, and it has similar, that kind of TV show takes a lot of inspiration from things like Stand By Me and from and generally from Stephen King. So again, a good cast from top to bottom, and part of the thing that really keeps audiences coming back here is Bill Skarsgård's Pennywise. Obviously, mentioned Tim Curry's iteration earlier from the TV movie. That was what kept people coming back for that particular iteration. And I think Bill Skarsgård does a very, very good job in matching that same love that audiences have for the character. I think it's, you're going into that role with very, very high expectations. I think it's one of the few films that actually uses CGI to its benefit. There's some great scenes where, his eyes roll all around his head. There's great use of CGI there, which we don't often say on this podcast, as many of our avid listeners will know. We often say the opposite. I think one of the things that really helps is that Bill Skarsgård, as he's demonstrated in interviews, has a very malleable face. a bit like Tim Curry does. You know, he's able to use his face physically. You know, that signature kind of smile that he does is something he can do. It's not CGI. And I think coupling that with a little bit of CGI here and there, and with those elements where they can make the character of Pennywise grow into these terrifying things and these terrifying things from the imagination of the central characters, really means that when it is used, it doesn't feel like it's just used for the sake of it. It doesn't feel like you could do something equally as scary with practical effects. That's not to say that you couldn't, but it doesn't feel immediately like that. I think one of the things that Bill Skarsgård brings to the character is that, that approach to acting that I think Tim Curry also had as well. They approach the character from a very well trained point of view. Bill Skarsgård obviously comes from a lineage of performers in his family, both his brothers and his father. Stellan Skarsgård are all performers, and so he's very much has that acting pedigree in his blood. Tim Curry was a very well trained theatre performer in multiple different aspects before he became Pennywise. And I think again it's a little bit similar to things we've mentioned in previous episodes where you could take nothing to detract away from somebody like Robert Englund's Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers, but they're not coming at it from a point of view of character motivation and getting into the role of a character. Whereas I think Bill Skarsgård kind of definitely done this with Pennywise. And I think Tim Curry did to a certain extent, maybe not to the same, when he had his time with the script as well and his time with the source material. And I think that really comes across. Like, it is very, very hard to separate Bill Skarsgård's face from Pennywise now. I think it's kind of ingrained itself into pop culture. I think perhaps, certainly for a younger audience, Pennywise is Bill Skarsgård. Obviously, for an audience who are slightly older, it's very hard to get past Tim Curry as Pennywise. But I think Bill Skarsgård has not surpassed Tim Curry, because I think it'd be very difficult to do that because they're totally different films and at totally different times and totally different approaches, and they had different goals when they were making those things. But he certainly sits right there next to him. They go hand in hand with each other, and I think that really comes across quite well. All I can think of is that memorable scene that kind of kicks us right into the motivations of Bill Denborough's motivation in finding his brother Georgie. That scene where he's looking into the storm drain, and you see that initial kind of smiley, creepy clown face of Pennywise. Both in the TV movie in the 90s and in the newest iteration in 2017, they both add something completely different. Tim Curry just very much felt very real, felt very much like, everybody's fears of that clown at the circus that everybody's scared of. Whereas Bill Skarsgård is almost a bit more mythical in it lends itself much more into that element of the the imaginary elements of the character. So they kind of stand side by side each other, but doing different things at the same time, which is I think always a good start when you're tackling a character that somebody has played previously, not trying to do the same thing again. I think it's even worse when it's than when sequels try and do the same thing again as the first film. But when it's a character who's been played by somebody else, you have to do something completely different, because otherwise it is just going to feel like a cheap knockoff of that character. A perfect example of a cheap knockoff is Jesse Eisenberg's, I never know how to say his name, iteration of Lex Luthor. It feels very much like a knockoff version of the Joker. He plays it very strange. Plays it like, I know he's not playing the same character, but he plays. It feels like he just went, well, that worked for the Joker, so let's do that there. And on the same subject of the Joker, Jared Leto's Joker compared to Heath Ledger's, it just feels like he's trying to do the same thing again, but doesn't really ever understand why it works so well for Heath Ledger. You compare Jack Nicholson's to Heath Ledger's, they're two totally different things because they decided to do different things. Whereas I think Heath Ledger to Jared Leto, it feels like a cheap knockoff in some ways. So in terms of how the film was made, obviously, as I mentioned briefly, Bill Skarsgård's kind of approach to the character. And he kind of said that it was such an extreme character and so inhumane that it was kind of beyond, a sociopath or psychopath. And he's beyond human, because obviously it's that. Towards that stage, we find out it's more of an alien type creature. He's not even a clown. He's just playing one of those beings that it creates. It truly enjoys taking the shape of the clown, Pennywise, and enjoys the game and the hunt, in Skarsgård's words. And he elaborated on his connection to the children, saying that there's a childishness to the character because he's so closely linked to the children. The clown is a manifestation of the children's imagination, so there's something childlike about that. And I think he's hit the nail on the head there. Ultimately we see, particularly in the first part of the new reboot, but in the first part of the TV movie as well, it's that childhood fear that makes Pennywise so scary. And even when they get older, they jump right back to when they were children, because that's what scared them when they were children. I think, interestingly, before Bill Skarsgård was cast, one of the people that was spoken about and one of the finalists of the role in the audition process was Hugo Weaving of Agent Smith fame and of V for Vendetta fame as well. So apparently Will Poulter was also in line for that, but he left the project slightly earlier on. And obviously Skarsgård eventually got the role, and reportedly it was because his ability to play more fun and childlike with Pennywise, and it kind of makes sense with his previous quotes about his interpretation of the character. Whereas I think Hugo Weaving played the creepy side much more, and obviously, whilst it's good to be that creepy side, I think part of where the creepiness comes from is because of that playfulness. And interestingly, Tim Curry, the previous actor of Pennywise, was actually offered the chance to reprise the role. But obviously, I think we know he's become quite ill in recent years, and obviously wouldn't necessarily be able to do it justice as he would probably like. And another name at the time that was mentioned was Ben Mendelsohn, who I think is a terrific actor. And I think, again, similar kind of vibes there from just an imaginary point of view, thinking about how he would play the character. I could see him being the creepy side of it. Not so sure about the playfulness side of it. I'm not so sure. But unfortunately, we'll never know, because apparently they couldn't agree on an appropriate salary for the role. So unfortunately, it did come down to money there. So we did get Bill Skarsgård, and he was on set for the majority of the production, but didn't actually begin filming his scenes until about halfway through the movie. and the time before he started filming was spent working with Andy Muschietti, the director, and also the producers in order to perfect his portrayal of Pennywise. And Skarsgård kind of stated that he felt an immense amount of pressure in order to play the role perfectly due to Tim Curry's well-regarded performance in it. And I think it goes back to that thing of having a respect for what the previous actor has done in that role and going, I need to do something different. I need to do something that doesn't necessarily immediately compare to that, so that people don't feel the need to go, oh, that's just a cheap knockoff, or that's just a poorer, ever-decreasing circle iteration of that same character. And in preparation for the role, Bill Skarsgård, did a lot of research into what's known as the Psycho universe to find his own way to perform Pennywise. He got inspiration from things like The Shining, Clockwork Orange, A Dark Knight, The Silence of the Lambs, so kind of well-known villains in movie pop culture history. And he did admit that he kind of got a little bit too into his performance, a little bit too much, and apparently would have quite a lot of nightmares during and after production. So there is kind of a little bit of a lesson to be learned here of perhaps don't take it quite so seriously or quite so in depth when it comes to playing these kind of dark, twisted roles, because it can very much get to a point where it affects your mental health. So a little bit of a lesson there. But one thing he did do physically was trained with a contortionist for his role in the movie. And I think that comes across very, very well. The physical aspects of this character was something that we hadn't actually seen. Not that Tim Curry's performance wasn't physical, but it was a different kind of physical than what we were used to with Bill Skarsgård's performance. And actually that comes across so well and adds such a different aspect to the character that immediately sets it apart from Tim Curry's iteration. And obviously we had Bill Skarsgård come back for part 2, which was a very, very important thing for the continuation of that story. However, it very almost didn't happen because, Bill Skarsgård said it affected him quite a lot playing this role, and he was a bit worried about his mental health going into, doing this for a second film. But apparently a week before the film was released, the first film this is, Skarsgård confirmed that he was actually going to be attached to the sequel and had already begun meeting with Andy Muschietti and discuss ideas for the characters and the second iteration of the film. And I think overall, just to close up this argument of Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise, is the best thing that I can say about it is that it doesn't really compare to Tim Curry's in the sense of you can watch the 90s TV movie and you can watch the 2017 reboot and its sequel and enjoy them both individually without having the need to compare them, without going, oh, well, Tim Curry was better in this, Bill Skarsgård is worse in this, or vice versa. They can stand side by side each other and you can watch both, and they both bring their own interpretations and their own positives to the source material. So I think Bill Skarsgård done an incredible job of living up to that expectation of Pennywise, because after 27 years, I believe it was, before he took on the role after Tim Curry, at that point, audiences, it become nostalgic, and when you're fighting with audiences' nostalgia, you're always going to be working uphill. So a lot of credit has to go to Bill Skarsgård in playing Pennywise here.
In space, no one can hear you podcast.
choice for a piece of great movie recasting is a piece of recasting that happened through no fault of anybody other than the fact that unfortunately the original performer passed away, and that's with Michael Gambon as Albus Dumbledore. Now obviously it was played by Richard Harris in the first two Harry Potter films, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, or if you're in America, Sorcerer's Stone, and Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Fortunately, between filming Harry Potter 2 and the commencing of Harry Potter 3, unfortunately Richard Harris passed away. So that kind of obviously forced the hand of the filmmakers to recast. And obviously it's not a case of being able to recast this particular, this character by simply removing the character from the script. He is an integral part of the story. So they had to really kind of look, quite hard to find somebody who was going to be a suitable replacement. And personally, I believe they found the perfect replacement in Michael Gambon. So I'm going to be looking more at kind of Prisoner of Azkaban, but obviously we know Albus Dumbledore went on to play him. Michael Gambon went on to play Albus Dumbledore in a number of different films. It was really the make or break for the series, really, post Richard Harris. So getting this casting wrong could really set the franchise in a slightly different direction from what they actually originally intended. I think the best thing they could do with this casting was to keep it along that same trajectory that they wanted from the first two films. And personally, I think they really did do that with Michael Gambon. So if we do look at the facts and the figures from The Prisoner of Azkaban, so it was released on June the 4th, 2004, with a high budget of 130 million. And it's safe to say they were well on track to meet their budget requirements by making 93.6 million in their opening weekend. So obviously you've almost made your budget back immediately with that. And then if we look at the gross for the US and Canada, 250 million in just domestically alone. So you've almost doubled your budget domestically already, but worldwide is really where they made their coinage. We're looking at $807 million, which is a fantastic return, especially considering that people could have switched off at this point because of the fact of Richard Harris wasn't going to be in this third film through no fault of anybody involved, just due to the sad tragic passing of Richard Harris. But they made the decision with Michael Gambon. There was some other names involved, but they made that decision with Michael Gambon, and audiences tended to enjoy it. So if we look at the IMDb rating, a 7.9 rating, which is a very, very high score, an 86% audience score for Rotten Tomatoes, which again is another incredibly high score for a film of this nature. So it's safe to say that, not entirely due to Michael Gambon, but it's safe to say that he certainly helped on his way towards making sure this went down as one of the better Harry Potter movies. So this is also where we had a slight change in direction as well. So we have Alfonso Cuarón, who directed this film, and obviously he tended to take it into a slightly darker tone. Now I think that's personally because it kind of followed that same narrative structure as the books, but also because we kind of recognised that Harry, Hermione and Ron, the three central characters, were getting older, and so more teenage themes were becoming more relevant, and so taking it into a slightly darker route kind of did appeal to that teenage audience who perhaps saw the first film like myself, loved it, saw the second film, loved it as well, and wanted to see it kind of take another step forward into how the audience themselves, mainly kids of that age, were growing up at the time. So it was also written, the screenplay that is, by Steve Kloves, obviously using J.K. Rowling's novel to create the story around. Producers were Chris Columbus, who directed, I believe, the first two films, also produced with David Heyman, Lorne Orleans and Mark Radcliffe. Composed, obviously, by John Williams, very iconic theme tune there, and also one that fits in with that John Williams trope of if you try and hum this theme tune and then think of another John Williams theme tune, it's very difficult to hear which one is which. The cinematographer was Michael Sorensen, editor was Steve Weisberg, casting director was Gina J, and the production designer was Stuart Craig. So one of the difficulties with the casting of Michael Gambon as Albus Dumbledore is that he has to, unfortunately, he has to live up to the expectation that Richard Harris had already set before him without really, having any other reason other than the fact that, unfortunately, he died. So it's not a case of this particular character wasn't loved by the fans and they needed to change it for the sake of the film. It wasn't a case of there was a dispute over pay or anything like that. It almost makes it more difficult because fans feel a little bit cheated, because obviously we haven't seen the continuation of Richard Harris's Albus Dumbledore. And also, coming into the cast of characters that you had with the first two films and also post this film, it really has to be, some gravitas of a name, because if you look at some of the names, obviously we have Daniel Radcliffe as Harry Potter. We also have Emma Watson as Hermione Granger. We also have Ron Weasley, which is played by Rupert Grint. So those are the central characters. But if we look at the extended cast in this film, we have obviously returning Richard Griffiths as Uncle Vernon, Pam Ferris as Aunt Marge, Fiona Shaw as Aunt Petunia. But also we have coming into the fold is some more well-known names. So people like Robert Hardy as Cornelius Fudge, people like Gary Oldman playing Sirius Black. At this point, the names that are coming in and the names that have been in are starting to get to the point where it's almost a little bit of a competition. You have to top that name. Previous iterations had people like Kenneth Branagh, had people like Robbie Coltrane, who's returning in this one as well. So you have to kind of obviously try and top those kind of names. And I think Michael Gambon fits the part, has the gravitas, and also adds something slightly different to the role as well. I think it's really, really important. I think the one thing that Richard Harris done fantastically well is he had that feeling of being a loving grandfather figure to Harry in those first two films. And I think we didn't quite get to see that exploration of where Dumbledore has to be a bit more firm with Harry, has to be a bit more tough love, has to show that tough love to Harry, like we see in the later iterations with Michael Gambon. We see glimpses of it where he quiets the grand hall when he needs to make an announcement, but we don't quite see that. And I think luckily we were just coming at a time where that's what was starting to be shown in the Dumbledore and Harry Potter. Who's Harry Potter? The Harry Potter character. It was starting to go that route. Not quite in this film, but it's certainly in the Goblet of Fire. We see that famous scene where he's questioning Harry. Did you put your name into the Goblet of Fire? That sort of thing, and we start to see that more aggressive side of Dumbledore, and I think that really helped Michael Gambon move past the shadow of Richard Harris. It would have been very, very easy to just kind of sit back and just coast with it, because almost you're playing uphill. You're trying to live up to something that I don't think anybody could ever live up to. But because this started to go in a slightly darker direction, it gave Michael Gambon the opportunity and the chance to be able to say, well, no, this is my Dumbledore. This isn't the Dumbledore of Richard Harris. Nobody can compete with that, but what I can do is offer you this Dumbledore. And I think by the time it gets to those really important character arcs and those really important narrative points in those latter stages of the towards the end of the Harry Potter series, we've built up that chemistry, we've built up that relationship with Michael Gambon's Dumbledore, and so we don't forget Richard Harris's Dumbledore, but we see it as two separate entities. It's no longer in the same. It's almost two completely different characters, without being disrespectful to either party. So I think that's really, really, or was really, really important to Michael Gambon's interpretation of Dumbledore. And when we look at, how they were going to go about casting, it was always going to be a very, very difficult uphill battle, because you needed to have that gravitas name. You needed to have that element of being able to be firm and stern with characters, but you needed that loving, caring side as well. So it was always going to be very difficult to kind of to fill those roles. One of the names that was actually touted was the name of Sir Ian McKellen. So that would have worked. 100% that would have worked. We'd seen something very, very similar in Gandalf. Now, the problem I think it would have had at the time is kind of twofold. One is we would have, I think, naturally compared it to Gandalf, because they look very similar for a start. They're very, big, long, white beard, that has that very similar mythical kind of aspect of that character. So we would have immediately compared Gandalf to Albus Dumbledore, and I think to set Dumbledore, aside from Gandalf, that would have been very, very difficult. It also meant that we would have had to have gone against Richard Harris's wishes of not casting Sir Ian McKellen, because they did not get on. They weren't particularly fond of each other, or at least Richard Harris wasn't particularly fond of Ian McKellen, because he, in his own words, called him a dreadful actor, which I suppose is each to their own. But, that would have made it quite difficult to be able to do that. Another name that they were looking at was Sir Christopher Lee. So again, making those same kind of links to other roles that he's played in the past. I think with Sir Christopher Lee, it would have been very difficult to get that warm, loving side out of it. Not to say that he couldn't do it, but I think for a lot of people, Christopher Lee is Dracula. He has that sinister side, he has that scary side to him, and I think it would have been very hard for particularly older viewers to get past that. Not so much for younger viewers at the time, which, to be fair, is what this movie is aimed at, but I think it would have been very, very difficult to be able to recast that in Christopher Lee. Another name was Richard Harris's longtime friend, Peter O'Toole, was touted for the role, but I think there were studio concerns at the time over making sure O'Toole was going to be able to last the 6 movies that were going to be following Chamber of Secrets. Apparently, Sir Richard Attenborough lobbied for the role. So we know Richard Attenborough could have done that. We'd seen his lovable grandfather type role in Jurassic Park, and I think we know he can do that more firm and stern side. But ultimately, he was turned down in favour of Michael Gambon, and I think it was a pretty decent move. Now, obviously, I've spoken about a little bit about the death, but Richard Harris, when he was first offered the role, he was initially a little bit reluctant because he was determined to play that character through the entire series. Unfortunately, during the filming of Chamber of Secrets, he was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and during post-production on that movie, producer David Heyman went to visit Harris in the hospital, though he was very, very weak from the Hodgkin's lymphoma. But Richard Harris insisted that the role not be recast at that time, and unfortunately Harris did die shortly before the production was to begin on Prisoner of Azkaban, necessitating a recast there. And obviously they ended up going with unfortunately now the late Michael Gambon, and I think it was important to the filmmakers that the Harris family and the legacy was upheld with who they cast in that role. I think it was important, as I said before, that they didn't forget about Richard Harris. They didn't completely, overlook him and, almost get to a point where we were going, actually, that's not, that's not what we wanted from Dumbledore. I think he was still very much a part of that role, even though, unfortunately, he had passed. And a little bit of interesting kind of coincidences is that this movie was actually the second time that Sir Michael Gambon had replaced Richard Harris in a role, with Richard Harris previously playing Inspector Jules Margaret in Margaret, and Michael Gambon took over the role in a television series of Margaret. So it's not the first time that this particular thing has happened, and Michael Gambon admitted later on that he saw no point in reading the books for the character of Dumbledore, since every part he plays is a variant of his own personality in his own words. So apparently during the whole course of playing the role of Dumbledore, he never read any of them, which I think it goes and shows you how good of a performer Michael Gambon, almost called him Albus Dumbledore there. He's so synonymous with that character for so many people. But it shows you how good a character he is how good a performer he is. I like seeing him be able to play somebody like Albus Dumbledore and then go and play somebody like the character he plays in Layer Cake, where it's completely different, and then go and play another character like he plays in King of Thieves, about the old boys who done the Hatton Garden job. He plays a bumbling fool of a character there. So it is really interesting for me to be able to see him stretch his acting chops, before he passed away. And I think this Harry Potter series really did make a fantastic move in casting him as Albus Dumbledore, because I'm not going to say it could have broken the franchise, but it certainly would have been very, very difficult to get to the heights it did without a fantastic Dumbledore, because he is so integral to Harry, the character, as well as the story. Because without Dumbledore, you don't get half of the character arcs that Harry has to go through. You take the Order of the Phoenix, for example, where Dumbledore is almost ignoring him. You don't get to see that aggressive side of Harry and that dark side of Harry without Dumbledore being there. And any reader of the books, any fans of the films will tell you that Dumbledore is incredibly, incredibly important to that universe. We've seen a further iteration played by Jude Law in the Fantastic Beasts series, which I don't think is anywhere near the Harry Potter series. Obviously, it's trying to do something ever so slightly different, and obviously it's a young Dumbledore. And I don't think Jude Law is particularly bad as Dumbledore. I just think it's almost it's the script he's in. It's the difficult productions of having to recast Johnny Depp at the time, having to recast that role several times just because of some difficulties outside of Hollywood. So I think it really goes back to how important Albus Dumbledore is, and how that role could have quite easily gone and very much set Harry Potter, the franchise, on a very, very different trajectory. I think that it came, obviously, not the fact that he passed away, but the fact that when he did it was only 2 movies into the franchise, meant that they still had enough groundwork and time to put in before it got to those latter stages. Because I think if it had happened, 2 or 3 films later, it would have been even more difficult And you wouldn't have got that same emotional response when Albus Dumbledore's character does eventually die and does eventually succumb to, Voldemort and all of those things. I think it would be very, very difficult. When I say succumbs to Voldemort, I meant Voldemort's people. I don't want any Harry Potter fans going, that's not how it happened. But, there we go. I think it's important that casting was on point, and it really was. As I say, a couple of examples, the Goblet of Fire, where he snaps at Harry and he shakes Harry and says, did you put your name in the Goblet of Fire? It's that first real point where we see the ruthlessness of Dumbledore. We first see that kind of other side to him. There's a reason why he's so powerful at the end of the day. Yes, he's a loving and caring and kind and good person, but ultimately he still is a very, very powerful man. And in the wrong hands, that power turns to Voldemort, for example. And Michael Gambon has that gravitas to it, has that, that same feeling that Richard Harris has without it being, just another version of Richard Harris's character. Michael Gambon added his own spin on the Albus Dumbledore character without destroying the legacy of Richard Harris's interpretation. I think if you want to really sort of compare Richard Harris's Dumbledore to Michael Gambon's Dumbledore, in those moments where he yells silence really show how accurate they both were to that character. It's a very similar way of performing that line, and they both do it in their own way. Gambon has a slight more sort of gravelly tone to his voice rather than Richard Harris, who just kind of has that almost that Shakespearean projection type of delivery. Not that Michael Gambon can't do that, but I think it's that differentiation that means that we go, actually, Michael Gambon is a different Dumbledore to Richard Harris's Dumbledore. There are similarities, yes, and they are the same character, but they are different at the same time. And I think that's so important, because ultimately, when you take on a role from somebody who has unfortunately not been able to continue on their role and continue on playing their role, playing that character in their own way, you have to be able to, take everything that character meant to people, add your own kind of spin to it, and build your own legacy on that. And I think it only kind of works when you have a name like a Michael Gambon, who is very, very well respected in the industry, or a name, although they weren't cast, but a name like Sir Ian McKellen, like Christopher Lee, like Peter O'Toole, people who are well respected, people who we know are phenomenal actors. It only really works with people like that. For example, let's take another name that you could have put in there in Sean Connery. I don't think it would have quite worked, because I think he's a little bit too angry to play a loving, caring a grandfather type figure. But it's that same kind of principle of having somebody who's been in the industry a long time, who's well respected, who has played similar type of roles in the past, or you can see them playing those similar roles in the past. I think without that, it becomes very, very, very difficult to be able to go, actually, this person is doing an injustice to the previous iteration of the character. And ultimately, we never really want to see that happen, do we? We want to see, a character grow, and we want to see a performance be good. We never go into a film wanting something to be bad. And I think without those things in place, we inevitably are always going to fall short of what those expectations are.
Visit the Michael Caine Tangerine Emporium for all your citrus fruit needs. Visit us in-store to peruse our limitless supply of Burmese citrus fruits, plus browse our selection of Lunchables. Or shop online using discount code I Bloody Told You to receive a 10% discount on our lean, mean tangerine machine for all your juicing needs. That's the Michael Caine Tangerine Emporium, Bond Street, London, England, we have tangerines the size of rubies.
Unfortunately, it's that time where we have to end the episode. Don't forget to like, follow and subscribe to wherever you get your podcasts from. Don't forget to also check out our social media platforms to stay up to date with everything Bury Our Bones with Cinema. So for today's episode, he's been Jimmy Murphy, I've been Ryan Etherington, and we have been Bury Our Bones with Cinema. Be a one-button job. Boom, 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 toom, toom, toom.
I have a terrible tendency to just swear without like, you're talking, when we're doing it, I still find it slightly distracting.
It's a bit weird, but I think it's a bit weird, but I suppose...
maybe if you listen to it back, see if it sounds... I was like, I'm going to have to stop it. You're listening back
Good job I observed that well, wasn't it?